We're going to move now briefly to the question and answer segment, and I'm going to urge you to please keep your questions very brief and concise and your responses as well, so we can get to our final panel before lunch, which is scheduled at 1. Okay, let's begin with Mike Rupert. Mike.
Brief procedural issue. Since you've combined two panels, we have lost one question per questioner. If I ask very short, brief questions, may I get the two questions, one from the first panel that you've combined into this one? And they will be very short.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, it's a great panel. I know most of you. I haven't met you, Marilyn. Dr. Newman, very familiar with your work on JFK in Mexico City. Good job. You three guys and I have presented a number of times, and I salute you. My first question, I'll direct it first to John Newman, but then the other guys can jump in. To summarize the Ballad of Omar Saeed Sheikh, which I'll call it the Ballad of Omar Saeed Sheikh, basically we have a guy who was at a Pakistani ISI asset, we'll call him that, who on orders of General Mahmoud Ahmad, the head of the Pakistani ISI, wired $100,000 to Mohammed Atta shortly before the 9/11 attacks. Thanks to Professor Michel Chossudovsky of Canada, who's written extensively on this and talked about it, we know that the head of the Pakistani ISI is de facto approved by the DCI here in the United States, Director of Central Intelligence, and there's a close ongoing relationship. Also, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, who is a colleague of Congresswoman McKinney's in open hearings, which I have quoted in my book, Crossing the Rubicon, documented extensively that the Pakistani ISI was used by the United States government, specifically the CIA, to arm the Mujahideen and the roots of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, especially in the years leading up to 2001. I and many others have drawn the conclusion that Omar Saeed Sheikh and General Ahmad wired this $100,000, could not have wired this $100,000 to Mohammed Atta without the approval, if you will, of the Director of Central Intelligence and the U.S. National Security Establishment. How do you feel about that?
I don't know. I just really don't have a feel for that. I just know that we were mindless in our approach to the ISI in Pakistan, not just at 9/11, but going all the way back into the 80s. It was proliferation, and counter-narcotics was always the excuse why we had to look the other way. And, of course, they were proliferating like crazy and doing nothing at all to stop narcotics. So it was a failed policy. But if you look at the State Department, the story there, and the White House initiatives, they did whatever they wanted to, and we blessed it. So whether or not Tenet was intimately involved every day with every decision, I can't address that. I just don't know.
All right. Nafis, do you have a feel on that?
I won't answer you directly, but what I will do is refer to a few interesting things that I've mentioned in my book. One report that I read, this guy he's British. In 1998 to 99, there was a report in one of the British press that Ahmed Omar Sheikh Saeed was offered amnesty by the British security services that, if you come to the UK, obviously we'll have to arrest you, but if you work with us as an informant, then you can live in London as a free man. Subsequently, he was seen in between 2000 and 2001 by people who recognized people who knew him before he actually went on to join Al-Qaeda. He was seen in those months several times. He had come in and out of the UK. And the government's response, as John mentioned, was to the outrage of the victims' families in the 1994 hijackings that he participated in, was, how could the government allow this to happen? This guy should have been arrested and prosecuted, and the response of the government was decidedly inadequate. Well, he hasn't been tried and convicted. Well, maybe that's what we should do in Britain. And the question remains as to what is his connection to the British government in that respect. The facts seem to suggest that he did go on to join and agree to the amnesty, which calls into question his relationship to the intelligence services and raises the issue. And there are a number of reports to this effect about Ahmed Omar Sheikh, which are very disturbing.
Okay. Let me move very quickly into my second question. Paul, early on you referenced the war games. Now, in Crossing the Rubicon, of course, I've done a detailed analysis of 3 field training exercise war games and two command post exercises that were taking place on 9/11, which effectively paralyzed NORAD response. We had Northern Vigilance moving a large number of U.S. fighters out of the Northeast Air Defense Sector at a time of heightened danger, very specific warnings. We have documented war game live fly drills taking place thanks to CNN and USA Today. Since the publication of my book, I have confirmed an additional exercise, Northern Guardian, which I only mentioned in passage, which also had moved fighters to Iceland and Greenland on the day of 9/11. And as many as 22 false radar injects inserted onto the Northeast Air Defense Sector radar screens. In light of the fact that in May of 2001, a White House order placed all war game exercises under the direct control of the Vice President, Richard Cheney, and his office, who had responsibility for scheduling all war game exercise, how would you categorize the scheduling of now 5 separate, conflicting, overlapping war game exercises on September the 11th, which paralyzed FAA and the Northeast Air Defense Sector? Would you call that an accident, or could you call that an accident?
Well, I think that's a very important issue, and one I've been looking into a lot lately. I'm about to publish an essay on the internet that I co-wrote with another person. Should come out in a week or two on the cooperativeresearch.org website, where we're looking into exactly this question. And following up on your research and other people's research, we found yet more war games. There's another one called Global Guardian that was actually described in one newspaper article as a practice Armageddon. So if you can imagine, on the day of 9/11, that there's a practice Armageddon involving large sectors of the U.S. military, and this is something that has not been commonly reported. And another thing we found that was interesting is that many of these war games seem to be coordinated together, at least in past years. You can see this from a lot of the names. We have Vigilant Guardian, we have Northern Guardian, we have Global Guardian. Obviously, there's a link there. And curiously, in the case of some of these war games, it appears that in past years they had taken place in October, and they were moved to early September in this year, causing seemingly a larger number of war games than was usual to all be taking place at the same time.
In light of the fact that the United States government, we now know, was swimming in detailed warnings about aircraft being hijacked to use as weapons against the World Trade Center, the White House, et cetera, multiple targets. We were swimming in threat warnings at that time, specific ones. Does it make sense to you that these 5, 6, however many now war game exercises would have been scheduled so as to weaken the response capabilities of NORAD, or Northeast Air Defense Sector, at that time?
Yeah, of course not. In fact, I find very interesting, which was mentioned in the New York Times and seems to have missed most people, is that in early July, Richard Clark and Condoleezza Rice were in a meeting, and one of the things that came out of that meeting was that they directed the FBI, the CIA, and the Pentagon to prepare for 3 to 5 simultaneous terrorist attacks. Now, of course, we know that there were 4 attacks, so that was a pretty good guess. And as far as we know, although they were directed very urgently to do something about this, we have no evidence that they actually did make those types of preparations. Instead, they were going ahead with all these training exercises, in the case of the Pentagon, which, in that time of great extreme danger, just didn't make sense. So I think this is one of the most important issues that we really have to look in great depth.
Okay, Mike, no more questions. You artfully turned one question into 5, so I'm going to ask for our Wayne Madsen to please honor the one question.
That's right. You can't trust those California guys.
My question is on the financing. I was wondering if any of you have looked into the activities of Russian arms dealer Victor Butt, who was transporting weapons, passengers, providing other air services for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda from his base of operations in the United Arab Emirates.
If I could just interrupt there, I believe I'm on the schedule to speak a second time, and I'm actually going to speak at some considerable length about Victor Butt.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Why don't we save that until the next panel discussion then?
The thing on the other intelligence director who resigned from an agency that was affiliated with al-Qaeda activities, and he was the head of Saudi intelligence, Prince Turki Al Faisal, who, by the way, has now been named by Saudi Arabia as the replacement ambassador for Prince Bandar, and he. Right now, it looks like the Bush administration, he's going to be allowed to present his credentials to President Bush, but Prince Turki had many meetings with bin Laden and Taliban and al-Qaeda leaders, so if anyone could talk about his role in helping to fund, he's denied it, and he sued Paris Match, the French magazine, for libel successfully, but I don't think we have to worry about Saudi lawyers in the United States. So can you say anything about Prince Turki and what he did, similar to what Mahmoud Ahmed did with the ISI?
Yeah, I could probably speak to that issue. He was fired. He had been director of the Saudi intelligence agency for something like 25 years, and he was fired about a week before 9/11. And I believe the Wall Street Journal and maybe one or two other newspapers actually speculated that his firing may have been a result of the Saudis having foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks and essentially trying to cut their losses because of his deep involvement with al-Qaeda. So that certainly is one possibility. And there are numerous press reports that suggest that he was visiting bin Laden in Afghanistan a number of times. He was participating in some very important meetings that involved Saudi intelligence and the bin Laden family outside of Osama, where large payments were made, agreements that we're going to send so many hundreds of millions of dollars over the next few years to al-Qaeda, and in return you promise not to attack Saudi Arabia. So there are all these different things that really need to be addressed, and the many 9/11 relatives have joined the Saudi lawsuit that have named him and many other people as essentially accomplices to the 9/11 plot. Unfortunately, he was taken off of that lawsuit because he has diplomatic immunity as a result of being an ambassador.
I'd like to piggyback on that point, too. The Crown Prince Abdullah did go to Afghanistan in early May to try and argue the case for not conducting attacks on the United States from Afghanistan. And I don't have time to go into the details of that, but if you look closely at that, I've always had the sneaking feeling, looking at the material, or what we do know about it, that it betrayed an early knowledge that the Saudis may have had of the attack.
I'd first like to thank people who compile reconstructions and chronologies without which analysis and conclusions are not possible. Prince Turki, has he not just been announced as the new ambassador here in Washington?
I guess so.
Yeah, yesterday. Wow. In view of what's just been said here. Let me just direct one question, a brief one, to Dr. Rosenthal, whose presentation I really appreciated. The question has to do with this wonderful quote about George Tenet, the fingerprints of bin Laden being all over this. What is your source for that? Do you remember?
I have a slide that lists all my sources.
Okay.
That's totally unreadable. I will give you my card.
But we can get together later. I hope it was Michael. Well, if it was Michael Gettler, then that's my source about this. If it was someone else, that would be nice confirmation.
My recollection is that it was from the Washington Post.
Yeah, okay, it was Michael Gettler. In our business, we have to be careful about false confirmation, okay?
Sure.
Let me tell you why I think that's important. He also said, that is, George Tenet, having breakfast with his patron, Senator Boren, as George Tenet is interrupted by one of his aides saying what had happened at buildings up in New York, he is quoted as saying, this has the fingerprints of Osama bin Laden all over it, and I wonder if that fellow taking flight training is involved. Now, why is that important? That is important because it shows me that George Tenet was fully briefed, fully informed about Moussaoui, and that as night follows the day, the President of the United States was fully informed about Moussaoui as well, because George Tenet was keeping him up to date on all this. And so the thing that has been prohibited from us knowing, i.e., the role of the President of the United States and the Vice President, what the President and the Vice President knew before 9/11, not covered in the Joint Committee report, not covered in the 9/11 Commission report, never covered. It's never covered, not even with respect to the commissions on Iraq. We know, at least from Michael Gettler in the Post, if that quote is correct, that Tenet knew that this was Osama bin Laden's operation, and he also knew about Moussaoui taking flight training in Minneapolis. And as I say, we can't be 100% sure, but I think it's a fair guess. It's a very good guess that the President knew chapter and verse about that and did nothing.
In fairness, I would like to contrast it with a quote when the President was told that the first plane had hit, I believe by Andrew Card when he was in Sarasota about to enter the elementary school. And this is from the Sarasota Herald Tribune. What he's quoted is responding, okay, and I haven't double-checked this as I have the Tenet quote. He was told that a plane hit the World Trade Center. The aide to Tenet said the World Trade Center has been attacked by a plane. Okay? And the President's response, if the quote is accurate, okay, said, wow, bad pilot.
I would maybe add that in the 9/11 Commission report, there is a little bit of discussion, although they didn't interview Colleen Rowley separately from the Joint Committee or the other people in Minnesota, but using their material, the focus on Moussaoui fit within that framework of knowing what it was about, because at one point a supervisor was berated by someone at headquarters. They don't name people in most places. FBI headquarters says to the Minnesota supervisor, "You're just trying to get people all stirred up," when they wanted to look at Moussaoui's materials. And he said, "Yes, I am, because I'm afraid that he's going to run a plane into the Twin Towers." Then they sent a memo to CIA on the same issue to look for him abroad, and the CIA memo alerted them, saying that we have reason to suspect that this person may be a suicide hijacker. Now, this is all prior to 9/11. Suicide hijacker is a pretty interesting term to take prior to 9/11.
The way they found out about Moussaoui's terrorist ties was by doing an end run around the bureaucracy. The people in Minnesota had to go to the folks they knew at headquarters in Langley, CIA headquarters, asked them to send a cable out to the field of Paris, and through liaison there in Paris, CIA got the answer that yes, he was tied, and George Tenet was drawing on that information when he made that comment. So a lot was known and a lot was told, and there's no acknowledgement whatever in the 9/11 report about that.
Can we give our panelists a hand here? We are, in the interest of time, and in as much as your thirst for knowledge and this information has required us to make a slight adjustment in our schedule. Rather than take a full hour break for lunch, we're going to break now. We will return here by 1 o'clock, which is basically a 10 or 15-minute break. If there are light refreshments in the back, and if the panelists would like to join the Congresswoman in 320 Cannon for a brief time, feel free to do so. When we return, we will just roll through the rest of the day, and we'll begin with the discussion with Loretta Napoleoni, Peter Dale Scott, Nafez Ahmed, and Ann Norton. Thank you all very much.
Let me give you my card, too.
Got it in.
Right now? Okay. Okay.
Tomorrow and Friday on C-SPAN, a public hearing reacting to the 9/11 Commission's initial report, hosted by Representative Cynthia McKinney. Part 1 Wednesday, and Part 2 on Friday, starting at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Next, a Justice Department indictment alleging planned terrorist attacks in California. Then, response to Hurricane Katrina from President Bush and federal agencies.
Thursday on the C-SPAN networks. Live programming begins at 7 a.m. with Washington Journal and 2 takes on the economy. One from President Bush's economic advisor, Ben Bernanke, on the impact of Hurricane Katrina. The other from Los Angeles Times reporter Peter Gosselin on the financial situation for the middle class. Also, a preview of an assisted suicide case coming before the Supreme Court. At 10, the Consumer Federation of America on the impact high gas prices are having on American households. At 11, Senator Charles Schumer on next week's confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee John Roberts. Live on C-SPAN 2, Robert Bork, Theodore Olson, and Jeffrey Rosen on the Roberts nomination and the advising consent role of the Senate. History on C-SPAN 3. At 10, the legacy of Paul Nitze, an architect of Cold War defense policy. And after that, the story of the interrogation of Soviet Colonel Oleg Penkovsky during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Looking ahead to this weekend on C-SPAN. Saturday night at 8 and 11, 4 stories from Congressman Sam Gibbons and Steve Pierce and Senator Chuck Hagel. Sunday on Road to the White House, Governor Mike Huckabee and Senator Evan Bayh. Sunday on Q&A, Senator Arlen Specter on the John Roberts confirmation hearings and his own battle with cancer. On Book TV, Saturday at noon, an encore presentation of In Depth with H.W. Brands. Live Sunday at noon, In Depth with Harvey Mansfield, who's written about Machiavelli and Tocqueville. And on Afterwards, Charles Peters and Thomas Fleming on Wendell Willkie, FDR, the 1940 election, and World War II. On C-SPAN 3 History this weekend, past confirmation hearings for Supreme Court justices at 10 a.m. and repeating at 10 p.m. Hearings for William Rehnquist, Antonin Scalia, Robert Bork, and Anthony Kennedy on Saturday. On Sunday, David Souter, Clarence Thomas, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Stephen Breyer.
Attorney General Alberto Gonzales announced today the indictment of 4 men, charging them in a plot to attack U.S. military facilities, Israeli government facilities, and Jewish synagogues in the Los Angeles area. FBI Director Robert Mueller participated in this 20-minute news conference.
Good afternoon. I am joined today by FBI Director Robert Mueller and John Richter, Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division. This summer, Americans watched so-called homegrown terrorists unleash multiple bombings in the city of London. Now, some in this country may have mistakenly believed that it could not happen here. And today we have chilling evidence that it is possible. But thanks to the work of able investigators and our strong partnerships among state, local, and federal law enforcement, we are here to announce the indictment of 4 men in an alleged conspiracy to commit terrorist acts in the Los Angeles area. Had these 4 defendants succeeded in their alleged plots, their attacks would have taken an untold number of Americans. The conspiracy alleged in the indictment returned by a Santa Ana, California grand jury extends from the cells of a state prison in Northern California to the communities of Southern California. 3 U.S. citizens and 1 legal permanent U.S. resident, originally from Pakistan, are charged with seditious conspiracy. Their alleged objective was to attack U.S. military facilities, an Israeli consulate building, and several Jewish synagogues in the Los Angeles area. The indictment also charges that the defendants were planning to finance their conspiracy using the proceeds from a violent crime spree. The 6-count indictment alleges that Kevin James, LeVar Washington, Gregory Patterson, and Hamad Samana conspired to commit terrorist acts in the United States. The indictment specifically alleges that Kevin James, an inmate in California State Prison, Sacramento, recruited fellow prison inmates to join JIS, a radical Islamic organization. Kevin James allegedly preached that it was a duty of JIS members to kill infidels, perceived enemies of Islam. James' definition of the enemies of Islam included U.S. government personnel, supporters of Israel, and Jewish Americans. To achieve his extremist goals, James allegedly sought to establish cells of JIS members outside of prison to carry out the violent attacks. According to the indictment, defendant LeVar Washington was recruited into JIS while in prison. Kevin James then directed Washington to recruit 5 people after his release from prison in December 2004 and train them for covert operations. James further ordered Washington to acquire firearms with silencers and to contact explosive experts so they could make or learn to make bombs that could be activated from a distance. In the months that followed, it is alleged that defendants Washington, Gregory Patterson, and Hamad Samana targeted and conducted internet research on and surveillance of U.S. military facilities in the Los Angeles area, specifically recruitment centers and military bases. In addition to the U.S. military targets, it is alleged that the co-conspirators specifically listed for attack Israeli and Jewish facilities in the Los Angeles area, including the Israeli consulate, El Al, the national airline of Israel, and various synagogues. Members of the conspiracy conducted surveillance on several of the synagogues, researching and planning to attack the synagogues on Jewish religious holidays in order to maximize the number of casualties. According to the indictment, the defendants purchased weapons in furtherance of their terrorist conspiracy and sought to finance their terrorist plans by robbing gas stations. Specifically, the indictment charges that beginning May 30th, 2005, the defendants, armed with shotguns, did rob or attempted to rob gas stations 11 separate times in cities and towns across Southern California. They also engaged in firearms and physical training in preparation for their terrorist attacks. If convicted of all charges, each of the defendants faces life in prison. Each of these defendants, however, is presumed innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. I want to commend the men and women of law enforcement. Thanks to the communication and coordination of law enforcement at every level, we were able to connect the dots and make these arrests before any American lives were lost. I'd particularly like to thank the FBI and the state and local law enforcement members of the Long Beach Joint Terrorism Task Force for their efforts in this investigation. As our men and women in uniform fight beyond our shores to protect America and bring freedom and democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan, it is up to us to defend our military men and women and our fellow citizens here at home. I'd like to have Bob Mueller now say a few words, and then we can answer any questions you might have. Bob?
Thank you, Judge. Good evening, everyone. And today we have disrupted an alleged extremist plot conceived in a California prison, and the members of that plot have been indicted. This is the result of the dedicated efforts of more than a dozen law enforcement agencies and prosecutors' offices working in partnership over the last several months. The cell's plans were prevented as a direct result of the immediate and effective action taken by officers of the Torrance Police Department as well as the Los Angeles Police Department. These officers, in the course of their investigation, gained information, recognized the information as being of broader intelligence value, shared that information with the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force in Los Angeles, and thereafter the task force used that intelligence to drive the investigation of the alleged terrorist cell, and as alleged in the indictment, uncovered this plot not only against the United States military facilities, but also against Israeli government facilities and Jewish synagogues in the Los Angeles area. Local, state, and federal authorities worked together and shared information together. Ultimately, that shared intelligence and our joint efforts helped us piece together the alleged plot now outlined in the indictment returned today. I would also like to thank members of the state and local law enforcement community, in particular the Torrance Police Department, the Los Angeles Police Department, members of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and others who work closely with the California Department of Corrections, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the United States Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and the other agencies who participated in this investigation alone with themselves or as a part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Los Angeles. Thank you, and be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Dr. Mueller, what more can you tell us about this JAS group? How many people they may have either inside prisons, outside prisons? How many people are under investigation?
Well, I can't tell you the number of persons under investigation. Today we've indicted 4 individuals. They're alleged in the indictment of being part of this group, and the investigation is ongoing.
How serious or widespread is this issue of recruitments within prison walls?
It has been something that we have been concerned about for a number of years. We have worked with the Joint Terrorism Task Forces to work with, in each of the states in which they're represented, the state and local correctional authorities to assure that we are alerted to instances where radical groups could arise in prison. On the federal level, we have worked with the Bureau of Prisons to monitor and assure that violent groups such as this are identified early on so that we could address them. I might add that you have in prisons, as we all know, we have a number of violent groups who extend their activities outside of prison, whether it be prison gangs or white supremacist groups and the like, and we are attuned to each of these entities who present a threat in our prison systems.
Dr. Mueller, can you tell us a little more about, you testified about this issue to Congress, but why is the Bureau just now sending out a letter? Can you explain what this letter is from headquarters to, or from wherever?
My understanding is there was a letter from the field office in Los Angeles that followed up on a conference that they had on this particular subject. I can tell you that over the years since September 11th, on a number of occasions, we have worked through the Joint Terrorism Task Forces with the local correctional facilities and with the Federal Bureau of Prisons to address the possibility of radicalization and radical groups arising in prison. So this is not the first time we have done it. Maybe the first time you've seen the letter, but this has been an ongoing concern of ours since September 11th that we have sought to address in a number of ways.
Director Miller, 2 questions. We have, in the past few years, used to having terrorism press conferences that are framed in terms of war against Al-Qaeda, war against Hamas, Hezbollah, organized foreign-based terrorist groups. As I read this and listen to what you said here, there's no reference to any foreign organizations or involvement in this, and I just wonder what that says to you about the evolving nature of the Bureau's counterterrorism efforts.
Well, there is no reference in the indictment to any international group. That is accurate. I could speak at some length, as I have in the past, about the efforts of the FBI to address terrorism, both domestic as well as international. As you well know, we have now 105 Joint Terrorism Task Forces. We had 35 before September 11th. We have field intelligence groups in each of our offices. We have a direction and requirements from headquarters with regard to areas in which we think the country may be vulnerable, that we follow up with our investigations as well as with our work with state and local authorities to identify the threats to the United States, whether those threats come from domestic terrorist groups or international terrorist groups. And the case today is an example of the work that we've done with state and local law enforcement. It is an example of intelligence coming from our work with state and local law enforcement, finding its way into the Joint Terrorism Task Force, pursuing the investigation as an intelligence investigation and a law enforcement investigation for a period of time, until such time as it became appropriate to request that the grand jury return indictments. And so this, in my mind, is an example of the work we are doing with state and local law enforcement to address terrorism, whether it be domestic terrorism or international.
The nature of the threat, and whether this is telling us something about the nature of the threat that the Bureau and the American public is facing, the evolving nature.
I think what we can say is certainly everybody understands the threat from Al-Qaeda. We went through September 11th. We understand the attacks that have taken place across the world. And so that is a threat that we deal with. We are concerned about persons coming into the United States and undertaking such attacks. But at the same time, we've always been concerned and always addressed through our joint terrorism task forces the possibility of homegrown groups, whether they have a particular ideology or not, who desire and express not only the desire but the willingness and the ability to undertake terrorist attacks. And what we have today in this particular example is, I believe, a story that it tells us how far we've come in terms of working with state and local law enforcement to identify a threat and then move to disrupt it.
You believe that it's purely a homegrown threat?
Let me just say one thing. In discussing our efforts since September 11th, we've described it as a war on terrorism, not specifically a war on Al-Qaeda. We know that terrorism exists in many forms. It exists not only internationally in terms of a threat to America, but also here domestically. And so we have worked within the Department of Justice to reorganize, to reform, to shape our thinking about dealing with the terrorism threats generally, not solely focused on Al-Qaeda.
One of the men indicted was a Pakistani national. Do you have any connection with any other overseas groups, or does this seem to be purely and exclusively domestic?
We do not have currently ties to international terrorist groups, but in the same breath, I'll tell you the investigation is continuing.
Do you think these men were apprehended quickly enough? 11 gas station robberies seems like a lot. It takes time to rob 11 gas stations.
You always, whether it be bank robberies or gas station robberies or any spate of crimes, you would hope to terminate them earlier rather than later. Thanks to the good work of the Torrance Police Department, these persons were arrested in the course of conducting one of those gas station robberies.
The indictment talks about firearms allegations. How close do you think they were to actually initiating some sort of an actual attack against synagogues, installations, anything else that's mentioned?
Well, they had taken steps, as the indictment lays out. They had taken steps to identify targets. They had purchased firearms. They were in the planning stages, and consequently, on a spectrum of activity leading up to a terrorist attack, they were well on the way.
I would just add that this is a little bit unique in that these folks had plans to commit terrorist attacks, but they had also engaged in violent acts to further that, and so this is a little bit different.
On another subject, if I can, there's a lot of concern.
Any more questions about this issue?
A criminal division question about the charging decisions. Number one, how much dust did you have to blow off of the seditious conspiracy statute, or is that something that you just use a lot around here? And secondly, why are there no what one would call conventional terrorism charges?
Well, the seditious conspiracy statute has been used by the department in terrorism cases ranging from the 1998 embassy bombing cases and before that. So it is obviously not a new statute, but it is a statute that has been used in recent memory appropriately. And we've used it during even more recently than that, and I'd be happy to give you a rundown of when we've used that statute.
Since 9/11?
I believe so, yes. And we make our charging decisions based on the facts as they are presented to us based on what we find in the investigations. In this case, we believe, as alleged in the indictment, that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt the defendants intend to levy war against the United States through terrorism.
We
change the subject to the hurricane for a second outside of
One more question on this issue.
Yeah, one quick question. I want to ask about the Bureau of Prisons. There's been comments by unnamed law enforcement officials that there are more alleged JIS members in prisons. Is there any kind of administrative action that's being taken to sort of try to deal with that threat? I mean, and still balance that with the rights of prison inmates? I mean, like, what do you do to try to, like, get to the bottom of that within the prisons? I mean,
Of course, we've had
prayer rooms or something? I mean,
Well, we've had numerous conversations and discussions about this issue with respect to our federal prisons, and as the director indicated, we've had numerous conversations with state and local officials regarding radicalization of inmates in state and local facilities. Are we concerned about it? Of course we're concerned about it, and we're trying to do everything that we can to identify the problem and make it certainly more difficult, if not prevent it entirely, from occurring within our prisons.
The charges say that this individual, James, started this group himself. What is the information you have on the extent to which it has spread to other states?
I think the indictment speaks for itself, and as I say, the investigation is continuing, and I don't want to get further into the facts of the investigation.
I mean, beyond the facts of this case, you don't have a good sense of whether this group itself has spread beyond the California
I'm not going to
state?
say we don't have a good sense. What I'm saying is that I don't want to get into any other aspects of the investigation that aren't in the indictment.
Attorney General Gonzalez, there is concern out of the hurricane zones of possible price gouging.
Sure.
I wanted to ask what you're doing with the FTC to try and head off that profiteering, not just in that area, but also regarding fuel prices nationwide.
Well, we have been meeting today, talking about the appropriate response, things that we can be doing to assist our citizens in the affected areas. Obviously, one of the long-term things we're concerned about are issues like price gouging, fraudulent charities, and so we're looking at perhaps setting up a task force, working with other agencies to put in place an infrastructure to deal with these kinds of problems. Short term, we're focused on ensuring that we've got law and order, sufficient law and order, working with state and local officials, providing whatever assistance we can to ensure that there's law and order in those affected communities. And obviously, that's our number one priority, is to focus on that short term.
For profiteers?
Well, anyone engaged in criminal activity, I can assure you that there are going to be investigated. Obviously, state and local officials have jurisdiction over certain kinds of conduct, but to the extent that we can provide assistance with respect to even state and local prosecutions, we will do so. But if you're talking about criminal violations of federal law, that will be something that we'll be looking at very hard.
FBI office in New Orleans, is it functional? Is the U.S. Attorney's Office functional
We are functioning. I will say that we are functioning everywhere. Physically, the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Orleans is closed. The U.S. Attorney is currently in the Baton Rouge office, and we're doing the very best we can. I want to assure the citizens in the affected area that the federal laws are being enforced, but there are some challenges. For example, the courts are shut down. I understand the Fifth Circuit is going to be meeting on Friday to decide or vote as to whether they're going to continue doing business. And so we've got some challenges that we have to work through, but I want to be as reassuring as I possibly can, given these circumstances, that we are going to enforce the federal laws.
Do you know whether all of your employees are accounted?
In a moment, a series of responses to Hurricane Katrina. We'll start with President Bush, then see what federal agencies are planning. After that, a look at effects on energy supplies from Texas Congressman Joe Barton, followed by the American Petroleum Institute.
Thursday on the C-SPAN networks. Live programming begins at 7 a.m. with Washington Journal and two takes on the economy. One from President Bush's economic advisor, Ben Bernanke, on the impact of Hurricane Katrina. The other from Los Angeles Times reporter Peter Gosselin on the financial situation for the middle class. Also, a preview of an assisted suicide case coming before the Supreme Court. At 10, the Consumer Federation of America on the impact high gas prices are having on American households. At 11, Senator Charles Schumer on next week's confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee John Roberts. Live on C-SPAN 2, Robert Bork, Theodore Olson, and Jeffrey Rosen on the Roberts nomination and the advising consent role of the Senate. History on C-SPAN 3. At 10, the legacy of Paul Nitze, an architect of Cold War defense policy. And after that, the story of the interrogation of Soviet Colonel Oleg Penkovsky during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Looking ahead to this weekend on C-SPAN.